So first, thank you all for being here. This is really an important day. Important day and an important topic. And it's not one topic, if you noticed. Each panel and each group is taking it a little bit differently, in a little bit of a different direction. And I think it's important for all of us to note that this is such a rich topic. It's very much multifaceted. And because it's such a large topic and because there's so many different communities when we talk about Jews of Arab lands in Iran, we decided to take each year to focus on one particular community in addition to everything else we're doing. So this year we're focusing on Iraq, and we have three really, really amazing speakers, each coming at it a little bit differently. And that's one of the beautiful things about this type of a conference is everybody is not a single discipline, but everybody comes at it a little bit from their own perspectives. And so keep that in mind as we hear our people. The first person I'm going to call up, if you don't want to hear me. First of all, I should introduce myself. I'm Drora Rusi. I am the director of the American Sephardi Federation Institute of Jewish Experience, and we are very honored to be partnering with these amazing partners for this day, including the Dahan Center and the World Jewish Congress and the Ben Tzvi Institute. It's just an important gathering of minds and people, so thank you for all that you were participating. So the first person I'm going to be calling up is somebody who came across the pond to speak to us today. She is an amazing woman, an amazing scholar, and just an amazing person all around, and I'm very proud to be presenting her today. Her main interest is the modern history of Jewish communities in the Islamic world and their responses to modernity. And I love this sentence in her bio: the focus is on the centrality and agency of non-European elites, thereby challenging assumptions about the center and the periphery within colonial networks. One of my dreams, One of my dreams is to do a tour around Israel of the strong elite Sephardi communities. It's amazing. When I went on a tour of Tel Aviv, that's what I saw. She's the author of numerous scholarly and trade publications, including her recent monograph, Baghdadi Jewish Networks in the Age of Nationalism, for which she did an exclusive author series for the Institute of Jewish Experience. And now we'll hear from, I didn't say her name, did I? Dr. Sasha Goldstein-Sabbah.
Well, thank you so much, Drora, for that lovely introduction, and thank you so much to Shimon Ohayon from the Dahan Center for inviting me to be here today. It's always a treat to come to New York and also to speak at the Center for Jewish History, which is such a special place to be, and I think it really, embodies the diversity of the Jewish people. And if we're then going to shift our focus today to the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa, a lot of people this morning spoke about what was lost. People with their suitcases and monetary loss and the trauma of loss. And that is all extremely important. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the cultural diversity that was lost and some of the things we forget about the richness of these Jewish communities. And I'm specifically going to speak about the Jewish community of Iraq. But of course, Iraq is a modern nation state that dates to after the First World War. And if you look in the archives, and I'm a historian, we really think about them as Baghdadi Jews. They see Baghdad as the center. Oh, good, there's my presentation. And the identity is Baghdadi. It's not necessarily bound towards the Iraqi state. Some people will later identify with the Iraqi state, but it's other things, right? It's the liturgy, it's the language, Judeo-Baghdadi, it's the history of this unique community. I'm going to talk about the dissolution of the Iraqi Jewish community between 1948 and 1951, But I'm not going to dwell on that moment. I'm actually going to contextualize it within the framework of the Baghdadi diaspora. So there were about 135,000 Jews living in Iraq in 1947, but by that period, you also had Jews who identified as Baghdadi Jews who lived all over the world, particularly in Asia, but also in Europe, other parts of the Middle East, and even North America. And these Jews still had a strong connection to Baghdad. So I know some of you know a tremendous amount about Iraqi Jewry, and I think some people know a little bit less. So very quickly, what I always tell my students is that the Jews of Iraq are the original Jewish diaspora, right? This is where the Talmud is composed. It's a central point of Jewish religious leadership for centuries. And Jews in Mesopotamia, later Iraq, weren't seen necessarily as outsiders by Muslim and Christian communities. They were seen part of this society. They were a community, they had their own identity, but they weren't seen as immigrants, as you would see in tropes in certain other places, both within Europe and the Islamic world. And the period of the mandate and early years of the Iraqi state, although far from ideal and very complicated, and I think Jesse will speak a little bit about this afterwards, they are seen as a moment of kind of a pluralistic Iraq where there's a lot of hope for the Jewish population, and where some Jews, not all, very much feel part of this Iraqi society. But one thing that's often lost when we talk about this golden age is how important this Baghdadi diaspora is. So this map comes from my book, and the one thing that's missing in it is the red lines should also point towards the United Kingdom. You have a small but important group of Baghdadi Jews who also live in the United Kingdom, and that makes sense, right? India is part of the British Empire. China, places like Shanghai, Hong Kong are very important for the British Empire. And the Baghdadi Jews are very much part of this imperial network. And what is Baghdad in this period? Well, it's part of the British Mandate. And the only reason that the United Kingdom is not on this map is it just wasn't big enough for the page to do anything that would look nice. It's not an ideological decision. But what I think we need to remember is that although we think about the Sassoons leaving Baghdad in the early 18th and early 19th century due to political instability, and so you could even think about them as refugees in some ways, certainly the other Jews who will leave Baghdad in this period before 47, they're not fleeing Baghdad, they're actually leaving Baghdad because of economic opportunity. And what is the difference? Well, I think the main difference is that when we flee somewhere, we're not necessarily going to come back, and we're going to try to get our family out. But in this case, Jews would leave, and they might spend a couple years in Bombay or Calcutta or Singapore or Shanghai, and then they would come back to Baghdad because they'd made their money, or they would come back for holidays, or if you wanted to marry a Jewish woman, maybe you would bring over a woman to marry. And we have some amazing letters in the archives that talk about women being sent over to marry second cousins, for example. And why is this? Because these were small communities. These were small satellite communities, but these communities were very much committed to maintaining their Baghdadi identity. They built synagogues, they built schools, and they saw themselves as Baghdadi Jews. And being a Baghdadi Jew meant multiple things, right? It meant a certain form of Judaism, which they were very proud of, a certain tradition, a certain commitment to these traditions, even while being in a very modern world. And one example of this is print culture. So in the 19th century, Jews in the satellite communities published in Judeo-Arabic, right? That would make sense. They wrote in Hebrew script, Arabic. And in the 20th century, as they became more integrated into these colonial networks, they began to publish in English, and English became a more important language. Again, this makes sense. But what's really interesting is that this also was a proxy print space for the Jews of Baghdad. Now, why was that? Well, censorship, both in the Ottoman Empire and in the early years of the Iraqi state, was something which was very severe. You couldn't necessarily publish what you wanted to publish. And so the Jews in Iraq used this print space to publish things that they couldn't publish in Iraq. So, for example, some Jews in Iraq, although not many, identified with Zionism in this period. Other Jews didn't, but those Jews who wanted to discuss ideas, they would use these newspapers in the satellite community. They would also use it at times to criticize the chief rabbi, Sassoon Kaduri, for example. And how do we know that so many Jews in Baghdad were reading these newspapers? Because when the Iraqi censors banned them from coming into the country, they complained that they can't get their newspapers. And these newspapers weren't just to complain about community politics or Iraqi politics, they were also to announce engagements and marriages and to put in recipes. And so these newspapers very much became part of the Jewish community in Iraq, although they were located in India and East Asia. Who are these two men? I'm a teacher, so I always ask my students questions to make sure they're listening to me. So who are these two men? Ben Ish Chai and who's the other one? Anyone? Yeah, Abdallah Someach. Who said that? Yeah? Nice. Everyone always gets the Ben Ish Chai. Abdallah Someach is more difficult. If you've read their Teshuvot, you see that they are also writing for the Jews of the Indian subcontinent, right? Kanun al-Nisa, the laws for women that the Ben Ish Chai will write, he specifically addresses the women in the Hindustani lands. And elites especially, but also regular Jews, let's say, in India, they will write to Abdallah Someach and they will ask him, how can I be a good Jew in modernity? They also finance the publications of their works. And this is now less due to censorship, but due to actually having printing presses in India. A lot of the most important works of these men are printed in India as well. So now we begin to see that some of the cultural flourishing in Baghdad was actually due in part to this very strong connection with these satellite communities. Similarly, they built the institutions, which I mentioned before. They built schools, they built hospitals. And what is interesting if we look at charitable giving is they built schools and hospitals and synagogues, but they continued to remit funds back to Baghdad, not only to help the needy, but also to memorialize Jewish life, because for them, Jewish life in Iraq was seen as being eternal, right? It was seen, and we see this in letters, as being a second Jerusalem. So they were supporting this life because it had a spiritual importance for them, and because that is what they saw as the center of their world, culturally and spiritually. They also gave as philanthropists. And this is one of my favorite pictures. It's of an Alliance school, so the Alliance Israélite Universelle, and we think of this as a French, organization, La Mission Civilisatrice, which Noam Stillman mentioned earlier. But when we get to talking about these Jewish elites and rethinking center and periphery, the money to build these schools didn't come from Paris or London. It came from Bombay and Shanghai and Hong Kong. And this was the Laura Kaduri School. And you can see that it's in French, but the girls, I've had discussions, we think they're making kube or kibbeh, depending on how you pronounce it, but if someone has better information, I'd love to hear it afterwards. So they're making a traditional Iraqi dish, but they're dressed in this modern way, and we know that fashion, ideas about modernity and what a woman could do often came from these communities in East Asia and the Indian subcontinent. You see the influence of this dynamic back and forth, but also that these schools were due in part because this flourishing diaspora community was in constant contact, and both were really dependent on each other. So, historic breaks. The Farhud, a tragic event in Iraqi history, but as I would argue, not the end of the community. Jews don't leave Iraq, but where do they want to go if they could go? in this period in 1941, during World War II, they want to go to India. They petition the British to go to India, and that makes sense. For them, that is their haven, right? Jews will leave Iraq due to the policies of the Iraqi state, right? People lose their jobs, they can't practice their businesses, they can't send their children to universities, and ultimately this will lead to a mass migration of Jews leaving Iraq in the period between 49 and 51 or 48 and 51. But what we don't think about always is that this is actually the end of these satellite communities and this dynamic between them. Because in the same period, the satellite communities are also falling apart. And the reasoning is not the same, although it's connected. But India, when we talk about partition, now we're not talking about Israel anymore. We're talking about India and Pakistan and the decolonization of the Indian subcontinent. It's a tremendous moment of unease and uncertainty for Jews. Shanghai, well, we know about the rise of communism. Singapore, the Baghdadi community is interred, many people leave. And in an earlier period, where would these communities have gone in times of uncertainty? They probably would have returned to Iraq. And we know this because you even have people in 46 who return to Iraq, right? Because they see that as a natural place to return if their satellite community seems unstable. But in this case, you have instability all around. And so actually, it's the state of Israel that becomes the new federating space for the Iraqi diaspora, and then to a smaller extent, London, which is also very important. So we see this shifting, and we see this dynamic space really changing. And I think it's important on this day where we remember the culture and the history of Jews in the Islamic world, that we also remember this cosmopolitan world in which they lived in, and the intellectual creativity that flourished, and that now in Israel flourishes again, but is certainly different. And I think we should take a moment to remember these societies in all of their glory. So I will stop there. If you're interested, you could read my book, of course. There's all sorts of anecdotes and lots of other information. And at the end, of course, I'm happy to answer everyone's questions. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Goldstein-Sabbah. And from Groningen University, which I did not mention, I just got excited, sorry. And one of the things she mentioned is that some of the Iraqi Jews went over to the UK. Well, our next speaker actually is one of those Iraqi Jews who went over to the UK. So I'm going to call up Mr. Edwin Shuker, and he is an Iraqi-Jewish businessman and philanthropist who is part of the Iraqi diaspora that we are spending this time talking about. He left only in 1971, and that's when he reached the UK as a refugee. He has been back a few times since, I don't know how many, he may tell us. He has some very interesting stories from there. I do encourage you, whatever he doesn't tell now, try to follow up with him because he has plenty. Somebody told us before that we should let Donna speak. I'm telling you, every speaker today, you can listen to them for hours and hours, and Edwin definitely no less. So thank you, Mr. Shuker.
My name is Edwin Shuker. I'm a Jewish refugee. And I want to tell you my story. My story is that of 1 million other Jews who lived in the Arab world in 1948 and Iran. And now, as we saw the statistics, just a few thousand. Today, I am a witness who will tell a testimony of what happened to me to my family, to my community. And as Elie Wiesel said, when you hear a witness, you become a witness. For there will be a day when the likes of me are no longer here. And that's when you tell, I heard it, and I heard it from someone who lived it. I was born in 1955. All this thing about the big displacement, I was oblivious to it. We didn't talk about it. My father was the only person left in Iraq. His parents, siblings, uncles, aunts. Can you hear me without?
Yes. We're recording.
Ah, okay.
We are.
They're all gone.
Is it on?
And for the 16 years I lived there, I did not even know I had grandparents or uncles or aunts, because the word Israel was not pronounced in 16 years that I was there. I lived a charming childhood. Loved every minute. 8 years. A diverse society. Our house was open door. The Muslim and the Shiite and the Sunni and the Armenian and the Assyrian, they just walked in and we walked to their homes. We had our synagogues, our two rabbis, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and our prophets, the 6 biblical prophets in Iraq. And Eid al-Ziyara, which is what we call Shavuot, is a time to go and pray. Yet all this changed for me in an instant. 1963, a military coup brought the anti-Semitic Ba'ath Party for the first time. What did they do? They had a plan. And I tell you what, when I come up to summarize, I think their plan worked. They basically ethnically cleansed the Jews of Iraq. And Shimon is asking, how come a community that arrived to this land in 586 before Common Era, 2,607 years ago, how can it disappear in 25 years? And I'll tell you how, and I'll tell you we are complicit in that. In 1963, I queued together with all the Jewish community as we were demanded to. Babies, old age, disabled people. We all were brought in to queue with our identity, with our Iraqi identity cards. And why? Day after day we queued until our turn came. Why is to replace our IDs with this one. A yellow card, exclusively for the Jew. And from 1963 onwards, we became second or third citizens. In the land that we were the indigenous crowd, we wrote the Talmud, we built civilizations, we saw Mongols and Ottomans and myriads of people. Yet, in our own land, we now carry a different blood. From then on, it was easy to start legislating against the Jew, because he's now earmarked. And when a law comes in, it says, as for the Jew, go to page 72. And the world had nothing to say. As we came nearer to 1966 and the war of Six-Day War, the propaganda machine started working. Every time I hear on the news, on the TV, on the radio, on the newspapers, there's a story. The story of Haskel, of Naji, of Naim, Jews who are traitors, Jews who have no ethics, Jews who are greedy, day in, day out. And the best thing is, we couldn't even leave. People ask me, are you a refugee? And I said, we beg to be refugees. We would give anything, just get out of here. But we were not. In 1963, our right to leave was taken away from us. And so, on January 27, 1969, when Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party came back again, we were already getting to go to school. Myself, my two sisters, younger ones, dressed for school when we heard today there is no school. Today it's a national holiday. Rejoice, O Iraqi people. And we will let you know later why. And at 9 o'clock the news came. The reason for the joy is aspiring that was caught. They confessed, they were tried, and on that day, January 27, they were hanged in prison. And that was not enough. Their bodies will now be hung in the public squares of Baghdad and Basra. And the national holiday is for the Iraqi people to bring these sweets and dance under these bodies. And then the names came out. 10 out of 14 names were Jewish. And every time a Jewish name is mentioned, my mother would shriek. They were either parents of our friends, neighbors, and 2 of them were underage. Over the next 18 months, more than 50 people disappeared, tortured to death, hung, or just gone. No one knows where. And so, life resembled death. And we had to do something. And we had to risk our lives. Each one of us. 1,900 people risked their life by trying to escape. Some were caught and taken back to prison, and others were luckier. I say luckier. Eventually we made it. But I want to tell you, I don't want to have these 3 days repeated, certainly not with a family and certainly with not my children. I don't know what courage my father had to put us through this. In crossing the mountains of Salah ad-Din with the help of the Kurdish people, God bless them, we were risking death because the drivers of the vehicles had to go through the mountains without putting a light on. The minute they would put a light on, they get shot by the army. Twice we had so much weight on these lorry. They actually rolled back to the valley of death. And just by the grace of God, it stopped. And the driver had to put us out in the mountains in the cold of night and the darkness and go and get another lorry because we were never going to make it. Eventually we did. And we sought asylum and refuge in the United Kingdom. And we rebuilt our lives like Jews have always done. My father found a job. My father is a lawyer, but he found a job within a week, packing t-shirts in Petticoat Lane. But he worked 6 days a week, and he sent me to university. And I worked just as hard. And I sent my son to Cambridge. And within one generation, the story of the Jewish people, whether it's in America, whether it's in England, whether anywhere in the world, they rebuilt our lives. But there was something missing in my life. When I was telling this story a sub-editor of a newspaper came to see me and say, Mr. Shuker, this was a fantastic story. I did not know there were Jews in Iraq. In my lifetime, the descendant of 2,600 years of history and 100 generations, he did not know there were Jews in Iraq. And I realized that my story, my people's story, is not being taught. Not in Israel, not in the United Kingdom, not in Jewish schools here, and certainly not in Iraq. We were expunged from the history. We had no trace. And at that moment, I took it upon myself, almost a personal responsibility and madness. I will not let go. I embedded myself in the Iraqi Arab world, and everywhere I go, I say, I am a Jew from Iraq, and I have unfinished business there. My grandfather lies there dead in a grave, and I want to see him. My synagogue. There were 54 synagogues in Baghdad in 1950. My prophets, shrines. And in 2003, at the fall of Saddam Hussein, I took the first opportunity and went to Baghdad. And I dreamt of building a new community. I dreamt that we don't have to be living there, but at least that connection, I won't let go. And of course, it didn't work. Every year, yawash, yawash, I knew all the, take it easy, it will happen. 2015, we filmed there, Remember Baghdad, the documentary, which was just being picked now by Netflix Europe, and it will be Netflix USA next. I urge you to see it. And in that story, it's a documentary about all the time we lived in. And in that story, I buy a house in Iraq. And people said, are you mad? Are you crazy? The first question in any setup is, why would you do that? We left. We don't want to see their faces again. Why would anyone buy a house? I bought a house, and I say I don't mean always I. There are dozens and dozens of me who understand why I did that. I will not let them get away with it. I will not let them frighten us out of our own heritage and our own history. Now I come to the title of my talk, which is the ethnic cleansing of Iraqi Jews. How was it done? How was it done, as you asked, Shimon? So first was 1950 and 1951. The laws that first of all told Jews, you want to leave? Just put your name here. Just register. What they didn't say to them that at the end of that period of registration, they froze all their assets. They took every penny they had. My grandmother, to the death, she had a list of how many rupees and how many golden liras they took away from her. They left them with 3 dresses, with one single ring, with 4 books, a list, and sadistically was checked as they left. God forbid if you take 5 books or 2 rings. That law, that ugly anti-Semitic law of 1951, how long did it last? What if I tell you that it is still valid in 2022? And it is the law that took away my nationality and Libby's nationality and Freddie's nationality, you know what that law says? That any Jew, only the Jew, if he's away for 2 months, 2 months, the government revoke his nationality and take all his assets forever. 2005, 2003, as I said, we were there. 2005, the Americans and the Brits told the Iraqis, hey, you've got to have a modern constitution. We have spent $1.5 trillion, the Americans spent, to get to democracy. At least you could do is to have a constitution. A normal country's constitution. They wrote a beautiful one. Lovely. The right, who is an Iraqi? Anyone who was born in Iraq, or from an Iraqi father, all the definitions. There is no difference between any religious or sects. Everyone is equal in front of the law. Fantastic. Everyone was so happy. 2006, the nationality law comes into being. And the nationality law follows the Constitution, except for one single sentence. The nationality law says, when I find it, beautiful, exceptional piece of legislation, and then it says, excluded from the benefit of this law shall be those Iraqis who had lost their nationality pursuant to law number 1 of 1950 and law number 12 of 1952. Only the Jew can never ever recover his nationality, ever. Relying on a law that was established in 1951 under the eyes of the Americans and the British and everybody who can read. Yet nothing happened. They continue to receive aid and they continue to receive visits. And Edwin continued to ask for his identity and for his nationality. And they continue to say, shwaya, shwaya. Until now, there is one single woman left from that Iraqi-Jewish community that we just heard about, the glorious Jewish community. And two very elderly, very dysfunctional people. And that one single woman now is being paraded by the government cynically, visiting the ambassador of France, visiting the ambassador of Russia, as here, the Iraqi-Jewish community. This is the president. Up to 2003, the communal properties were kept by Saddam Hussein for whatever reason intact. Since 2003, the last 21 years, nothing has been left. Nothing. What's left now is few pieces of properties in Baghdad. I would estimate what was in the community coffers in property at over $1 billion in 2003. Yet nothing happened. And finally, the law that brings in the final solution. They took the nationality, they took the property, they banned us from ever recovering it, and now comes law number 1, 2022. 16 clauses. Glorious. Let me just read one of them. And then you could figure out what's the other 15 are like. Article 7. A sentence of death by execution or lifetime imprisonment will be applied to any person who seeks, any Iraqi inside Iraq or outside Iraq, who seeks to normalize contact or promote the entity or any Zionist or Masonic ideas, principles, ideologies, or acts in any form, whether public or secret, including conferences, gatherings, literature, publications, social media, and by any other means. 1 clause out of 16. That destroyed all my contacts overnight. Since that law, I have stopped connecting and I cannot go back to Iraq. Right now, my life is seriously in danger. Can I have 2 minutes? Thank you. I just want to end up with some practical thoughts. I want you to demand from our Jewish leaders to come and hear us today. I don't see here any key people, any decision maker. I don't see the AJC, the WJC, the ADL. They have to know my story. They have to promote it. In the UK, we started at the Board of Deputies a commission on diversity, and it came up with 119 clauses on how to bring Mizrahim, Sephardim, and Jews of color into mainstream Judaism. You should do the same here. I want my history to be taught in the Jewish schools here. I want you to fight these anti-Semitic laws of Iraq by doing what the Soviet did in the Soviet campaign the Jews did. When an Iraqi official and the Prime Minister, they come here for aid and money, I want you to chain yourself and say, what about my people? I want to salute a couple of people. I want to salute Shimon Ohayon for bringing our stories to this land, for continuing ceaselessly, whether it was Javier Knesset or whether it's on the hair of Dahan Center. I want to thank the Foreign Ministry of Israel this year. They have given budget to every single consulate and embassy and told them, make an event on the 30th of November and report back. Thank you. Thank you.
I can't say I didn't warn you that you can keep hearing people. So the caliber we have here, I have to, admit and have to brag about, and it will continue. So our next speaker is actually on the heels of Professor Stillman, who we heard earlier in the day. Dr. Jesse Weinberg received his PhD in Jewish history at the University of Columbia under the direction of Professor Norman Stillman. He is here with us today because...
University of Oklahoma.
What did I say?
Columbia.
Oh, thank you. I meant Oklahoma. I'm reading Oklahoma. Thank you. He's written on Jewish communities and anti-Semitism in the Middle East, most recently in the Encyclopedia of Jews in the Islamic World. So he is going to talk to us today about anti-Semitism in Iraq. I know, thank you for correcting me.
No problem. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be as eloquent as the speaker before me. He was really there, and I'm not. I'm just going to give a historical overview of it, and I'll try to do the best that I can. Iraq is the setting of the story of the Garden of Eden. After World War I, Baghdad was the home to a prosperous Jewish community. Historiography says the 1920s was a Jewish golden era. Jews were the largest ethno-religious group in the city. An intellectual class emerged, and the middle class grew. Nevertheless, this talk's title is a double entendre. Like the Garden of Eden, the golden era was a fable, not as golden as recalled. We'll survey anti-Semitism in the 20th century Iraq, its growth as a force in government, and the decline of the Jewish status from equal citizens into what the state called an internal enemies. Why examine Iraq in particular? Iraq could be a roadmap to understanding anti-Semitism in the Middle East. The country has a long Jewish history from the biblical era, no border with Israel-Palestine, no direct connection with the Palestine's Jewish issue, nor rival interest with it. These characteristics will allow us to better differentiate political strife from anti-Semitism. Understanding these factors will produce a better understanding of anti-Semitism's development in the region. This talk broadens the usual scope of anti-Semitism in Iraq, covering the 1800s to the mid-1900s. Historians typically focus on two events: the Jewish exodus in 1950-1951, and the Farhud, the mass violence against Jews on June 1st and 2nd, 1941. This talk refutes three popular theories of anti-Semitism in the Middle East. All three say anti-Semitism is not product of the local historical development. The theories are: 1, anti-Semitism came from Europe; 2, there was no anti-Semitism; and 3, anti-Semitism was high and constant since Islam's introduction. Today I hope to show: 1, there was anti-Semitism; 2, Iraq's variety of anti-Semitism came from the Middle East; and 3, anti-Semitism is linked to events, it is part of the historical process. Anti-Semitism was a backlash from anxiety as Muslim dominance would end. Anti-Jewish stereotypes evolved from notions of dhimmi, non-Muslims under Islamic rule. In the medieval era, negative images of Jews were literary devices to illustrate Islam's truth or justify Muslims' monopoly on power. These motifs became kernels of what scholars call anti-Judaism, a series of tropes framed in religious rhetoric and preserved in sacred texts that characterize Muslims as the authority, ethical and strong, and Jews were portrayed as weak, ill-willed, and needing protection. These tropes said Muslims protected Jews. Dhimmi means protected in Arabic. It's what I call the hierarchy of faith. Jews were lower, often worked low-status jobs, barred from authority roles. Violations of this hierarchy sparked violence. In 11th century Islamic Spain, Samuel ibn Nakhrela, and after him his son Yehosef, became chief minister of Granada. Polemicists who cherished dhimmi norms said, who cherished dhimmi norms said Jewish ministers violated the Dhimmi Compact. The Ibn Nakhrelas were devils. A pogrom erupted. In 13th century Persia, Sa'ad al-Dawla, a Jewish doctor, was chief minister. Firebrands decried al-Dawla would destroy Islam. Pogroms erupted. Taboos against Jewish authority and equality would be the seedbeds of anti-Semitism from the 19th century on. When Arab nationalism and global capitalism exacerbated prohibitions. Then the Ottoman Empire ruled the Middle East and expanded non-Muslim rights. The Tanzimat, an Ottoman reform program to strengthen the army and economy, granted equality to all sects in 1856, including Jews. Sea traffic drew Iraq into the world market. Basra, Iraq's port, was on Britain's route to India. Businesses were established to service these ships, creating a new career opportunities, a middle class of clerks, rail workers, and liberal professions. Jews benefited from this new economy. Excluded from institutions of power, Jews concentrated in sectors Muslims scorned but capitalism favored, finance and industry. As customs changed and the restrictive dhimmi laws fell away and Jews economically improved or gained rights, traditionalists felt menaced or tried to force Jews to obey defunct dhimmi ordinances. Street rowdies would harass Jews in nice clothes. Steps toward equality sparked backlash. In 1908, the Young Turks, a reformist coalition that introduced the Constitution, ignited anti-Jewish riots. The Young Turks promised equality. They allowed Jews in the civil service to stand for elections. Jews, then a majority in Baghdad, elected a deputy. There was anxiety Islamic sway would end. Agitators said Jews welcomed the new order. Young Turks were Jews. In Iraq, insurrectionists said equality weakened Islamic norms. In Baghdad, mobs attacked Jews. Riots lasted 6 weeks. As threat to a hierarchy exacerbated, so did violence against Jews. In World War I, British troops occupied Basra. In 1917, they imperiled Baghdad. The government incited against dhimmis to raise morale. They said Jews were spies. Jews sabotaged the economy. authorities massacred 17 Jewish money changers. The governor, Faik, planned to kill Baghdad's Jews, but retreated from approaching British troops before he could enact it. Despite the political changes, dhimmi notions persisted. In 1921, they shaped the creation of Iraq. They were drafted into law. British administrators focused on the British Empire's cohesion. Iraq was a link to British India. Administrators wanted Iraq as an ally. So they built the country atop dhimmi conventions to appease public opinion. Jews were treated as a millet, separate from Muslims, still regulated with Ottoman codes. The Jewish community continued to function as an autonomous association. The chief rabbi remained a civil servant, as in Tanzimat times. Where these regulations were replaced with the laws of the Jewish community in 1931, the new statutes affirmed Jewish separateness. The community administered its own hospitals, courts, and schools. They had financial autonomy. The Gabela, a kosher meat tax, funded expenditures, and Jews were expected to support their own welfare. Public schools did allow Jews, but were in Muslim neighborhoods. Even in Baghdad, where the community pushed for schools in Jewish areas and Jews were the largest population, the government refrained to fund them. The government enacted institutional discrimination. Laws weren't explicitly anti-Semitic, but were promulgated to parallel dhimmi norms. Jews received less public funding and were disfavored in employment in several fields. Jews were indirectly taxed at higher rates. Jews concentrated in import fields, so the government decided to derive most of its revenue from customs, not from income. Jews were expected to have little political voice. The Constitution granted Jews a parliamentarian and a senator, but urban Sunni deputies were entitled to counts of nomadic Shiite populations, whom they neither represented nor had connections. This amplified Sunni sway well beyond their numbers. Prosperity occulted the full effect of the conventions implicit in the state. Britain's occupation boosted the economy. British administrators hired Jews, and Jews entered the Muslim-dominated civil service in noticeable numbers. A fifth of Jews were new hires. Imports surged. Jewish firms participated heavily. They represented major companies, General Motors, Ford. Others joined the new liberal professions in the economy, such as medicine, law, and finance. But the progress was illusionary. Most Jews in civil service were hired by Britain or Britain's Jewish appointees. Britain appointed Sassoon Heskel, who was Jewish, as finance minister. Heskel hired Abraham El-Kabir to be accountant general, and El-Kabir hired Jewish subordinates. Yet once the initial government Britain organized dissolved in 1923, Heskel served only 10 months. Iraq's monarchy excluded him from all future cabinets. His protege El-Kabir was overpassed for promotions. El-Kabir never advanced. Jews continued to be assistants, once money changers interpreters for Ottomans, now civil servants in ministries such as mail and transportation or financial professionals. Ministries of power, defense, and foreign affairs were nearly devoid of Jews. Even in Baghdad's Chamber of Commerce, an organization in a field stereotyped as Jewish work, the president was always Muslim. From the 1920s, Kalmia, a form of Arab nationalism that excluded Jews, propagated in the school system. Kalmia said Iraq was for Arabs and defined Arab as a Muslim descendant of the 7th century Islamic conquerors of the Middle East. Kalmia said Jews were Europeans and did not belong in Iraq. It said Jews wore European clothes, learned European languages, and pursued liberal occupations. Government supported Kalmia's polemicists and cultivated these myths in literature, punditry, and the arts. In part, Kalmia was a backlash against Jews entering spaces dhimmis never entered in large numbers before. Social disparities created a glare. A tiny minority of a minority became wealthy, disturbing those who cherished dhimmi norms. Jewish prosperity received inordinate negative media attention. The issue was not disparity. A few dozen Baghdad Turks in 1900 dominated officialdom, but that Jews entered respectable professions at all. Prior to 1920, outside trade or medicine, neither Muslims or Jews worked in the same field before. Muslims monopolized government. After 1920, Jews entered every career path. Jews worked in government. This was considered a usurpation. The popular poet Mullah Abud al-Karhi wrote the poem, "The Carpet Was Stolen." It's an allegory for minorities stealing Iraq. Published in Karhi's newspaper, El-Kar, the plot recounts his carpet's disappearance on a train. The train was a metaphor for Iraq. Karhi realizes that everyone aboard, all the passengers, all the conductors, are dhimmis. They crowd him, they trap him, Karhi mourns that his carpet was precious, but he cannot find it, and there are no Arabs. The station master is Jewish. Quote, my time passes a prisoner of Moshe and Ezra, between a Yitzchak in his brain and a Moshe, unquote. When the staff apologizes, the carpet is gone. Karhi alone gazes at, quote, the Jew, while Jews are now Shahs and Ottoman officials. Fear of this dhimmi reversal permeated politics. In 1924, the government granted citizenship to all Jewish inhabitants, including Jews. It sparked resentment. Weeks after, an officer, Sadiq al-Qadri, published brochures warning against Jewish equality. Qadri said Jews are parasites. Jews engage in a campaign of hate against Muslims. Jews want to rule Iraq. The Prime Minister, Yassin al-Hashimi, and his Justice Minister, Rashid Ali al-Gailani, refused to charge anti-Semites with laws that banned people from defaming religious groups. The Jewish community asked the state to intervene. The government just refused. Instead, Yazid warned one journalist, Anwar al-Shaul, it would close his newspaper if he wrote against Qadri. In 1928, Yazid and Rashid Ali organized a protest that they alleged was against Zionist plans to colonize Iraq. In 1932, the League of Nations granted Iraq independence on condition it promised to protect minorities. However, in 1933, 3 events increased anti-Semitism. First was the Assyrian massacre. The army massacred 300 villagers, Assyrian Christians, amid a conflict with Assyrian separatists. To avoid self-incrimination, the government blamed Assyrians for the atrocity. Xenophobia increased. Second, a new king, Ghazi, descended the throne. On radio, he praised the Assyrian massacre. He denounced foreigners and Jews. He gave state sanction to anti-minority feeling. Third, an education official, Sami Shakat, introduced an extremist Kalmia club into high schools called the Fatuwa. The Fatuwa taught Jews are an internal enemy that needs to be liquidated. In 1934, the government enacted the first restrictions against Jews in an unofficial manner, never in writing, but with a conscious policy of marginalization. 1. Many Jews were terminated from the civil service. 2. High schools and colleges imposed numerous clauses to limit their number. 3. The government banned foreign Jewish publications, saying these defamed Iraq. 4. The government restricted Jewish travel through non-bureaucratic compliance, such as ignoring applications. 5. Government imposed odorous regulations on Jewish schools, saying they were propaganda centers to vilify Iraq. A year later, in 1935, the government formally codified Jewish undesirability. Jewish immigrants were banned. Jewish instructors were banned from teaching quote-unquote Arab subjects, such as history, Arabic, and civics, under the assumption Jews disliked Arabs. In 1935, Rashid Ali and Yassin began a secret program of state-sponsored anti-Semitism. They created government-run organizations dedicated to opposing democracy, Jews, and Britain. The Muthana Club, which recruited military officers to promote Shawkat's Kamiyah, the Committee for the Defense of Palestine, which distributed pamphlets warning Zionism would annex Iraq, and the White Society, which urged violence to make Iraq more Arab. Most crucially, from 1936 to 1938, the government and Muthana secretly lobbied Britain for permission to expel Iraq's Jews. In 1940, during World War I, Rashid Ali, then Prime Minister, attempted to move Iraq to the Axis orbit. In secret negotiations, they agreed to cooperate, quote, against the Jewish-English policy. Arab countries have the right to solve the Jewish question in the national and racial interest on the German-Italian model, end quote. Britain needed Iraq as a link to British India, a major source of wealth and manpower. Britain's ambassador ordered Iraq's regent, Abdullah, dissolve Rashid Ali's cabinet or Britain will invade. The regent removed him. But Rashid Ali used the government's own anti-Semitism program to seize power. He conspired with Muthana, which recruited military officers, and had among them the 4 commanders of Baghdad's bases. On March 31st, 1941, these officers toppled the government. They made Rashid Ali prime minister. Rashid Ali established Iraq's first explicitly anti-Semitic regime. Propaganda said Jews were friends of the English. They were internal enemies. Accusers said Jews signaled British planes to strike Iraqi targets. Residents alerted police, reporting Jews for very normal behavior, carrying a violin case, drinking at a coffee shop, hanging clothes on a line, all alleged to be flagging enemy aircraft. Once Britain invaded, Iraqi defeats generated anti-Jewish mass violence. Initially, Iraqis thought they were winning the war and there were no riots. But on May 6th and 7th, 1941, British planes bombed Baghdad. In response, a mob attacked a Jewish hospital, accusing patients within of directing the attacks. In Basra, rioters pillaged Jewish stores. The next day, on May 8th, government radio announced, quote, "We then shall be taken on the internal enemy, and we shall hand him over to your hands for destruction." Even the Farhud, Iraq's largest atrocity against Jews, followed this pattern. On June 1st and 2nd, 1941, perpetrators murdered perhaps up to 500 Jews in Baghdad. A primary source for the Farhud is a government report Iraq produced to determine the cause. According to the report, as British forces approached Baghdad on May 30th, Rashid Ali's government fled. On June 1st, the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, pro-British authorities returned. It was then several Jews in holiday clothes were seen by Iraqi soldiers who thought they were celebrating Iraqi's defeat because they were the internal enemy and stabbed them with knives. Passers-by joined the attack. Assault spread to different neighborhoods. The perpetrators seem to have believed their government. Jews were friends of the English, internal enemies. The British army was outside. A dhimmi reversal was imminent. A survey of mass bloodshed against Jews, the riot of 1908, the massacre of the money changers in 1917, and the Farhud reveals each crime occurred in the aftershock of defeat. Assailants felt the hierarchy imperiled and accused Jews of assisting an external enemy, either the Young Turks, Britain, or Zionism. The external enemy was actually irrelevant. The crux was the hierarchy was threatened and the internal enemy was believed to be Jews. In each episode, the pillars of authority crumbled and Judaism was on display, such as its festivities or Jews in spaces they were previously forbidden. In 1908, Jews attended the Young Turks gathering at a mosque. Both the massacre of the money changers and the Farhud occurred on the cusp of Jewish holidays, 1917 on Purim and the Farhud on Shavuot. Each happened as the government toppled to non-Muslims or secular foes, Britain or the Young Turks. Rashid Ali's regime was a watershed. Policymakers accepted the allegations that Jews were an internal enemy. Jews need to be countered. Jews ceased to be friends of the English because now the government was pro-English, but politicians paired Jews with new external foes, communism and Zionism. Press and radio said Zionism intended to conquer Iraq, as Rashid Ali once said, but now anti-Semitism was more firmly linked with the Palestine crisis. Iraq opposed partition, Iraq entered the 1948 war. Since the state openly turned against Jews, there were no more massacres. Attacks, yes. Incitement, yes. But no more mass violence. Partition in 1948 sparked pogroms in other Arab countries, but not in Iraq. Firebrands were satisfied the government attacked Jews. Instead, defeat brought state oppression. The day after Israel's independence, Prime Minister Mohammed el-Sadr arrested thousands of Jews on charges of communism or Zionism. Most infamous was Shafiq Ades, partnered as one of Basra's largest financial firms. His execution on September 23rd was declared a holiday. Mass arrests followed the same pattern as attacks in times of defeat when Judaism was on display. The arrests were to expand the war. This was the policy supporters' own term for it. In February, Israel's parliament convened for the first time, and Iraq's tribunals sentenced 11 to death for Zionism. On March 10th, 1949, Israel conquered the Negev, and Iraq's tribunal sentenced 23 to death. A second wave of persecutions began in September 1949 with the Jewish holiday season. In 6 weeks, 1,000 were imprisoned. On Yom Kippur, police raided a synagogue, arresting worshippers as they prayed. In Baghdad, police cordoned Jewish neighborhoods, ransacking homes. More dragnets followed on Sukkot. In parallel, Sadr instituted a series of anti-Jewish laws that transformed Iraq into an anti-Semitic state. Under the assumption that Jews were an internal enemy, he revoked Jews' firearms license for protecting the rear. Agitators said Jews restricted credit to injure Iraq. So Sadr reassessed Jewish income, requiring arrears so high for a year at any time. There were up to 600 in jail just waiting to pay. Sadr's government said Jews departed from Iraq to attack Iraqi soldiers in Palestine. So he forbade Jews traveling abroad. He banned Jews from selling real estate or wiring money to thwart them from leaving. Jews were banned from working in what he called sensitive government positions: ports, hospitals, schools, railway, the foreign ministry, police. 95% of Jewish officials were fired. Public institutions ceased to accept Jews: the juries, the military, public schools, universities. Public hospitals even ceased to accept Jewish patients. Measures to denationalize Jews were in the context of combating the internal enemy. By 1950, 25,000 Jews fled. Politicians said Iraqi Jews abroad were a threat. Parliament approved the ordinance to remove nationality. Jews could leave if they renounced their citizenship. Those who left illegally would be denationalized. Even Jews abroad legally more than 2 months would be denationalized. All denationalized Jews would be deported. Saleh Jabr, the interior minister, defended the law, saying, quote, to keep their Iraqi nationality inevitably would lead to results affecting public security. It would do the country harm if they remained. I'm just wrapping up. In 1951, the government froze Jewish assets, even those legally abroad. No victim could access their property until the police issued Jewish identity cards, proving the bearer never registered for the nationality ordinance. Jews became legal pariahs. Carrying Jewish IDs was obligatory. It had to be produced at financial institutions for all transactions. Travel restrictions became permanent. Jewish travelers received time-limited passports, and if they failed to return in time, they were denationalized. Now the conclusion. Iraq's anti-Semitism is from the Middle East. It evolved from notions of dhimmi, anxiety Islam will end, opposition to equality, and Iraq's own Arab nationalism, Kalmiya. Anti-Semitism followed a pattern, but it was not constant. Jewish rights increased in the 19th century, reached a peak in 1924, then cratered as Kalmiya took hold, and traditionalists rallied against equality. Whereas Jews were once dhimmi, whose social position affirmed Islamic mores, their status changed to internal enemies under heavier restrictions than dhimmi ever historically suffered. These findings serve as a paradigm to better understand the origin of anti-Semitism in the region. Thank you.